Aaron Beck, a renowned psychiatrist and creator of the cognitive therapy of depression, died on November 1st of 2021. He was 100 years old. During his long and prolific career, he published numerous books and articles on cognitive theory of depression and other psychiatric disorders like anxiety, addiction, and schizophrenia. Cognitive behavioral therapy, to which he contributed in a major way, is considered most evidence-based and frequently most helpful amongst all schools of psychotherapy. Clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers today learn the theory and practice of CBT. The basic idea is simple. Mental disorders are thinking disorders. How we think influences the way we feel. Teach patients to evaluate and restructure their thinking, and this will change how they feel and how they behave. Here's the question. How did Beck come up with his new ideas, new theory? He was a psychoanalyst by training. There was no other way to become a psychiatrist back in his day than to become an analyst. So something happened that prompted Beck to develop his new ideas. What was that? This is Dr. Fedorchenko, addiction psychiatrist in Dallas, Texas. Today, let's talk about early development of the cognitive theory of depression. Most people introduced to the topic know about the early influence of Albert Ellis, George Kelly, and Jean Piaget on Aaron Beck. He relied on their work and research in formulating his own theory. These authors require a separate introduction, but let's just remember that Albert Ellis came up with the idea of automatic thoughts prior to Aaron Beck. He called them self-statements. George Kelly developed the personal construct theory, and Beck tried to borrow his ideas in early development of the cognitive theory. And of course, Jean Piaget, one of the most renowned cognitive scientists of the 20th century, Beck used his ideas of the schema while attempting to describe how automatic thoughts, that is, that thoughts that can negatively influence how we feel and behave in depression, so how automatic thoughts arise. I want to acknowledge these authors because they're important for modern psychology and because that's what we read in textbooks. But today I wanted to concentrate on something else. How did Beck create his theory? What happened that he finally stopped following the psychoanalytic rule and created his new ideas? To understand that, we have to go back all the way to 1954, when Beck first started working at the University of Pennsylvania, and follow him up until 1967, when his first book on cognitive theory was published. In 1954, young Aaron Beck joined University of Pennsylvania. Up to that point, his path was typical for a physician. Undergraduate degree at Brown University, Yale Medical School, and then 4 years of psychiatric residency. Then he does 2-year fellowship at Austin Riggs, a private psychoanalytic institution. Now, I want to stop here for a second. Austin Riggs was a center of egopsychology at that time, one of the schools of psychoanalysis. Okay, real quick. Most of us know that Sigmund Freud created psychoanalysis and introduced the term unconscious into the clinical work with patients. He was not the first one to use the term per se, but he really made it the center of attention. According to Freud, we have a conscious mind and the unconsciousness. An unconscious mind is filled with id, that is driven by sexual and aggressive impulses. Understanding and uncovering the unconscious material leads to the resolution of any particular symptoms. To understand a patient's disorder was to understand the unconscious. This was a centerpiece of his work. As the time went by, some of his successors started to deviate from this central line. This caused a lot of conflict, but the bottom line is that with time, certain people started to concentrate more on the ego, most notably his own daughter, Anna Freud. Ego mediates the interaction between the destructive id drives and the real world. It functions according to the reality principle, taking into consideration everything that goes on in the objective world. The id functions according to the pleasure principle. It constantly and continuously wants to fulfill the wish of the sexual and aggressive drives. Here's an important point. Ego is mostly conscious. To help patients, ego psychologists would mostly concentrate on the conscious material. This was one of the big differences between the classical psychoanalysis and the new school of ego psychology, and it might be important in our understanding of Aaron Beck. Here guys, this is the iceberg metaphor to describe different parts of psychic life. You can easily find it online. We have different levels of psychic life: unconscious, preconscious, unconscious, and different domains as well: id, ego, and superego. It contains our biological drives, mainly aggression and sexual impulses. Ego helps us behave as normal human beings, and superego are just moral norms imposed on us by parents and the society at large. As you can see, Freud thought it is completely unconscious. And to relieve the symptoms that a given patient has, we have to understand the drives. Freud always looked at the unconscious, and drives always want to influence us and get out of the id. Now, if you look at ego, ego is in the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. Ego psychologists would say that we need to concentrate on conscious material, right here, and the ego interaction with the id in order to relieve the symptoms, right here on the border. Beck's teacher at Austin Riggs, David Rappaport, would say that ego does not have access to unconscious, so let's stop paying so much attention to it. There's no interaction between them right here. Now you can see how this could influence Beck in future when he was developing his own theory of depression. Finally, notice preconscious. Preconscious is something out of awareness, but we can become aware of this material if we pay attention to it. So it can get to conscious. Two simple examples. Notice socks on your feet. Most likely, once you put them in the morning, your brain shuts off the sensory information from your feet because it's not relevant to what's going on with you. But once I ask you about the socks, all of a sudden you can feel what it is like to have socks on your feet. So the sensory information went from the preconscious into the conscious. Another example is when patient describes conflict with the partner to the therapist. Therapist notes that patient appears anxious. All of a sudden, patient feels that their muscles are tight, that they feel the knot in their stomach, and that they feel threatened. All these have been going on throughout the session, but they were in the preconscious. Once therapist noted it, the patient became aware of these sensations. I will mention preconscious later in the video, but this is the psychoanalytic concept that resembles the concept of automatic thoughts introduced by Aaron Beck. Austin Riggs was an unusual place for that time. It was a collaboration between psychoanalysts and psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, social workers. It was a team of people to whom exchange of ideas, collaboration, and experimentation meant a lot. The years spent at Austin Riggs were formative for Aaron Beck as a psychoanalyst. So now Beck was at the University of Pennsylvania. At that time, he completely embraced psychoanalysis. And he wanted to study it. He wanted to do some experimental work. His first project was to study hostility in dreams. The main psychoanalytic theory of that time stated that the symptoms of depression are caused by aggression inverted toward oneself. Instead of releasing the aggressive drives lurking in the unconscious, a person blocks them with defense mechanisms. The aggression then builds up and eventually is directed toward the person, because the energy of the drives has to go somewhere. If it doesn't go into the environment or onto someone else, then it starts to get directed onto the person. And then we have all the symptoms of the depression: the helplessness, the hopelessness, the feelings of rejection, the self-blame, all the way up to the suicidal ideation. So Beck and his collaborators tried to test this idea by looking at patients' dreams. Why dreams? Well, the psychoanalytic theory postulated that dreams were the closest approximation to the unconscious. By understanding the unconscious and its drives, we can understand patients' disorder and relieve their symptoms. So it would follow logically that the dreams of depressed patients would be full of aggressive fantasies directed toward oneself. What they found was the opposite of this hypothesis. It was the non-depressed patients who had more aggression in their dreams than the depressed patients. Depressed patients had more of a sad themes in their dreams about the rejection and loss, most notably. By that time, Beck was already questioning some of the ideas of the psychoanalysis, and the results of this study was one of the first time when he really started to feel uncomfortable with the major tenets of the theory. Nevertheless, he stayed loyal to the cause. Let me quote from the Beck directly. "We then reasoned that the hostility was unable to penetrate through the dreams, but it still existed at an unconscious level and assumed the form of a need to suffer. Because of this theme, we labeled these dreams as masochistic and found that using this negative portrayal of the dreamer as a symbol of the need for personal suffering clearly differentiated the patients with depression from those without." Yeah, guys, if you are into the convoluted and boring explanations that don't quite make sense, read psychoanalytic literature. So he assumed that the aggression that was directed against oneself was not able to get through the unconscious barrier and was manifesting as one needs to suffer, one's need to punish themselves, hence the masochistic content of the dreams. He then wanted to test this idea. Beck reasoned that if depressed patients had a wish to suffer, then failing at a certain task or getting a negative feedback following a task would make them perform better because their wish would be fulfilled. This turned out to be wrong also. Depressed patients perform much better after getting positive feedback. So now Beck had 2 points of evidence. One, there was no hostility in dreams of depressed patients. Two, there is also no wish to suffer as far as he could say from experimental work. Beck then comes to the conclusion that seems rather straightforward today. His direct quote, "The dream simply represented the way the dreamer perceived the self." So it was not unconscious material. The symptoms of depression were linked to what a person consciously thought of themselves. So let's go back there for a second. What Beck essentially did, he made some conclusions about the real world based on the observable data. See, ultimately, and here's my serious science hat, ultimately, any scientific theory has a component of inference. We make an inference about what is actually going on in the real world based on the things that we observe. Beck observed that the dreams of the depressed patients are full of themes of rejection and loss, and he assumed that this is linked to how they actually consciously perceive themselves. This is exactly what Sigmund Freud was doing in the late 19th century. Not the conscious stuff, but he also would observe patients lying on his couch, free associating in the room. Then based on the observation that he saw, he made some conclusions about what potentially might be going on with people. He assumed that the material repressed by the conscious defense mechanism is going somewhere different from the conscious, the unconscious. And this was based on the fact that when he would put patients in a hypnotic state, the repressed material all of a sudden would come up, and the session of hypnosis would lead to the resolution of the symptoms. So, he had his whole set of evidence to make all these assumptions. Now, why do I tell you that? Freud was doing his thing in the late 19th century and coming up with the ideas of unconscious, and then some 60 years later, Aaron Beck is making his experimental work and comes up with the ideas of cognitive theory of depression. What's the big deal? Well, I want to erase this oppositional difference between Beck and Freud, because they essentially did the same thing. They observed what was going on in front of them, in the office, in the room with the patient, and they made assumptions about the true nature of things, of true nature of the disorders that they were facing in their patients. So it was not Freud that Beck disliked, and certainly not psychoanalysis. Up to his later days, he considered himself part of egopsychology, and he even joined the Psychoanalytic Institute in the late 60s all the way up to the late 70s. And not even the lack of evidence in the psychoanalysis, because you can perform experimental work and gain evidence. Rather, it was rigidity and inflexibility within the psychoanalytic society. People simply didn't want to test the ideas, to put them against the scientific rigor, and they would blindly believe what was written in the textbooks by Freud and other psychoanalysts. They did not want to change their mindset in the face of the contradicting data. This what really prompted Beck to distance himself more and more from the main psychoanalytic theories and finally find his own way of helping his people. As history shows us, Aaron Beck was 100% right. This rigidity and lack of flexibility within the psychoanalytic society coincided with the broader historical process in the American psychiatry. In the 1960s and 70s, psychoanalysis starts to lose its absolute power within the United States. New scientific developments, the psychopharmacology, the biological psychiatry, cognitive science come to prominence, and more people turn to the new ideas and the new evidence. In fact, there was so much conflict within the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania that at some point Beck decides to leave, and in 1962 he quits his job and he takes a huge sabbatical. It was in the next 5 years that he publishes first 2 articles on the cognitive theory of depression, develops his famous cognitive triad. This is the idea that the negative views about oneself influence the negative views about the world, and these views influence the negative views about the future, and the views about the future influence the negative views about oneself. And hence we have the self-fulfilling prophecy that a lot of times drives the depressive symptoms that people can experience. Finally, in 1967, after coming back to the University of Pennsylvania, he publishes his first book on cognitive theory of depression. It was also during this time when Beck reads a lot about the burgeoning cognitive science and the developments of the behavioral psychologists. He reads on Jean Piaget, George Kelly, and of course Albert Ellis. It appears that cognitive theory is really an amalgamation of all those things. And here we can see the influence of Austin Riggs on Aaron Beck, because in those 2 formative years he was also surrounded by people to whom the collaboration and exchange of ideas were very important. And we can also see the historical links in the development of the psychotherapy thought at large, because it started with Freud and psychoanalysis and the unconscious, and then the egopsychology comes to the stage and says, well, let's actually look more at the conscious, and it might be that the conscious is not anyhow connected or related to the unconscious. And then it took another several decades for the Beck to come to the stage and to say that the evidence shows us that the depression is more likely to be caused by what the person thinks of themselves and not some drives. First and foremost, there is a continuity in our understanding of how the mind and brain works. The oppositionality comes later. Now this picture should make much more sense. Ego psychologists would say it's not really about the id, it's more so about the ego that mediates the interaction between the id in the real world, Aaron Beck said that he was not even going to look at the unconscious material, that our unconscious drives didn't matter, and there was no evidence for their influence on the depressive symptoms. He only wanted to concentrate on the conscious material and the way that people thought about themselves. And it looks like that he thought of automatic thoughts as possibly coming out of preconscious. Not necessarily the repressed material that we don't even have access to, but rather that type of sensation or thinking or emotion that is out of our awareness, but if pointed out to, we become aware of that. From that time in mid-1960s, Beck's ideas start to pick up faster and faster. During his time away from University of Pennsylvania, he also develops the famous 3-column and 5-column known to any psychologist working within the CBT school. This is when we make patients write down their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and we make them rate their feelings, 100% sad or 50% anxious, something like that. So it all started with Beck doing his own analysis and trying to see how his thoughts are related to his feelings. And here's another thing that is so much common sense psychology these days, but was not at all evident when Beck was writing all his articles and books. You know, based on his empirical studies, he finds that the depressive symptoms come from the way the people perceive themselves, so from their thinking. But he goes one step further. He says that normal thinking is the ability to make judgment from the rational standpoint, from a more realistic basis. That is, normal thinking is the ability to think in a rational way, like a scientist. Moreover, psychopathology can be seen as the deviation from the ability to think logically. A healthy mind is a mind that is rational, logical, and scientific. This is the essence of cognitive therapy. Yes, I know that I have to mention Albert Ellis and rational emotive behavioral therapy and the fact that Ellis actually contributed in a major way to cognitive behavioral school, and for some of these ideas he was the first one to introduce them. Albert Ellis deserves a video of his own, probably at some later time. So by mid and late 60s, Aaron Beck starts to fully embrace this new approach to the psychotherapy work. I just want to give you 2 quotes from that time that I think demonstrate well the essence of his distance from psychoanalysis. In 1966 he writes, "I have finally come to the conclusion that the best approach is to make a clear sweep of the current doctrines, whether of the psychodynamic or descriptive nature. This means starting from scratch and accepting none of the doctrines on the basis of authority or majority opinion. And also, I realized that support for psychoanalytic postulates was ultimately derived from the declarative statements of the psychoanalytic authorities rather than the evidence. I began to quaver in my belief that 20,000 analysts can't be wrong." The story of Aaron Beck and early days of cognitive theory are interesting to me for several reasons. One, it shows the continuity of our creative ideas, and creative work is the only work that brings something new to the world. Either psychoanalysis or egopsychology or cognitive theory. And a lot of times our opposition toward each other is not because of the ideas themselves, but because of our interpretation of them. In case of psychoanalysis, it was the unwillingness of the establishment to study its own ideas, and the authority bias. If someone said that, that must be right. The textbooks are written about that. Within the department, it became a lot more about power and politics and less so about the sense of wonder and helping other patients. I can claim that about every single psychoanalyst for every department within the United States, but the struggle was real in 70s and 80s. And yes, also the fact that most people, at least initially, reserved to the luxury of the private practice. You know, why fight or why search for new ideas or why confront all ideas if I can just open my own practice, start seeing patients? Who cares if the ideas are not correct in some sort of abstract and scientific way? That was also a part of it. So, lots to think about. But the bottom line is that today cognitive behavioral therapy is spread out throughout the world. We have the neuroscientific evidence of why and how it works. We have a lot of empirical data. And sure enough, it does not solve all the issues and it doesn't work for all the patients because nothing does, but it definitely has proven its efficacy and efficiency in the real world. So thank you, Aaron Beck, for being curious and for not giving up on your ideas. Let me know what you think about this story. And in any case, I hope that you like this video. If so, consider subscribing to my channel. There are more videos to come. Thanks for watching and stay rational.